The room was quiet, almost painfully so. Everyone on the set had paused mid-action, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jonathan Roumie, the actor known for bringing Jesus to life on screen, had approached Clint Eastwood with a mix of respect and nervous anticipation. After all, Clint wasn't just a legendary director and actor, he was a living icon in the world of cinema, someone whose presence could make even the most confident actor second-guess themselves. Jonathan had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times in his mind. Advice, encouragement, maybe even a compliment. He knew Clint's reputation for blunt honesty, but he hoped for guidance, something that could help him refine his craft, something that could help him portray the figure he so dearly admired with even more authenticity. And then Clint looked at him. Not a smile, not a nod, just a sharp, unwavering gaze that seemed to cut through the air itself. The room seemed to shrink as he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're not Jesus." Those 4 words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Shock rippled through everyone nearby. A few gasped quietly, some leaned forward, unsure if they had heard correctly. Jonathan froze. Not because of disbelief, he had expected bluntness, but because the statement felt heavier than anything anyone could have imagined. It wasn't an insult, but it wasn't a compliment either. It was a challenge, subtle yet seismic. Jonathan's mind raced. How could he respond? What could he possibly say to one of the greatest living legends of film? Many would have faltered, taken offense, or tried to explain themselves. But Jonathan didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadied himself, and let a calm smile spread across his face. His eyes met Clint's, steady and unwavering. "I know I'm not," Jonathan said softly, yet every word carried a quiet strength, "but I try to live in a way that matters." A ripple of tension released, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. Clint's eyes narrowed for a moment, and then something shifted, an acknowledgement, a nod, a quiet respect. The moment, simple as it seemed, was electric. Everyone in that room realized they were witnessing more than just a conversation. They were witnessing humility meet wisdom, ego meet gaze, and experience meet intention. In that instant, Jonathan's response did more than answer Clint's blunt statement. It changed the energy of the entire room. What happened next would leave everyone present with a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes, the most powerful statements are the ones that don't try to prove anything at all. After that moment, the set seemed to exhale. People returned to their duties, but there was a palpable shift in energy. Jonathan Roumie walked slowly, thoughtfully, through the quiet corridors of the studio, replaying Clint Eastwood's words in his mind. "You're not Jesus." He wasn't angry, nor was he discouraged. Instead, he felt a strange mixture of humility and determination. It was a typical afternoon on a Hollywood set, crew members bustling between cameras and lights, costume designers adjusting robes and tunics, assistants rushing to manage schedules and props. But in that routine chaos, Jonathan moved with a calmness that seemed almost out of place. His mind wasn't on the scripts, the shots, or the looming deadlines. It was on understanding the depth of the words he had just heard. He remembered the countless hours spent studying the life of Jesus, trying to internalize the compassion, patience, and unwavering commitment that the role demanded. He had read the Gospels multiple times, studied historical texts, and worked tirelessly to make each gesture, each word, authentic. Yet, Clint's blunt remark reminded him of a simple truth. No matter how deeply he immersed himself, he was still human, still fallible, still learning. Jonathan took a seat in a quiet corner of the set, away from the cameras. He looked down at his hands, thinking about all the moments he had doubted himself, the nights he had wondered if he was good enough. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned his abilities, but somehow Clint's words hit differently. They weren't a critique of skill or performance. They were a reminder that being human came first. That humility and authenticity were far more important than perfection or praise. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood didn't retreat to his trailer or lose himself in work. He observed Jonathan from a distance, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but in interest. Clint had spent decades in the film industry, and he knew talent when he saw it, but more importantly, he knew character. He had learned, over a lifetime, that the way a person handles challenge, criticism, and humility often reveals more than any performance ever could. Jonathan finally spoke, though not out loud. "I know I'm not Jesus," he whispered to himself, "but I have to be the best version of me in this role." He felt a calm settle over him, a kind of inner confidence that didn't rely on approval or validation. He understood that his response in that moment would shape how he approached the rest of the day, the rest of the scenes, and ultimately, the impact he could have on those watching. As he rose to leave the corner, The crew noticed the difference. There was a quiet intensity about him now. A focus that didn't demand attention, but naturally drew it. He walked toward the set, nodding politely to everyone, his presence commanding respect without a single boast. People whispered among themselves, "Have you noticed how calm he is? He's not defensive at all." The cameras rolled, lights bright, and the scene was ready. Jonathan approached it differently now, carrying an authenticity that was impossible to teach. His gestures were measured, his expressions thoughtful, his delivery sincere. The words he spoke weren't just lines from a script. They carried the weight of understanding, humility, and the lived experience of striving to be better. Clint Eastwood watched from the director's chair, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had seen actors crumble under criticism, inflated praise, or lose their focus entirely when confronted with the truth. But Jonathan, he had done neither. He had listened. He had reflected. He had responded, not defensively, not arrogantly, but with a quiet strength that spoke louder than words ever could. By the end of the day, the crew and cast had begun to notice something extraordinary. There was a ripple effect. Jonathan's calm and humility influenced everyone around him. The tension that often lingered on set dissolved into collaboration. Actors found themselves more patient, assistants more considerate. Even the background crew moved with a new sense of purpose. One by one, people began to realize that the lesson Jonathan had embodied was far greater than any line of dialogue or camera angle. It was about the power of composure, the strength of humility, and the influence of character. And in that moment, Jonathan understood the truth behind Clint Eastwood's blunt remark. He wasn't Jesus. But the way he chose to respond, the way he carried himself, and the integrity he brought to the role were lessons in humanity that no actor could teach. Sometimes, the most powerful transformation happens not in the spotlight, but in the quiet spaces, where we choose how to react to truth. The day ended with a sunset spilling through the studio windows, casting a golden glow across the set. Jonathan stood for a moment, letting the light wash over him. He smiled, not in pride, but in gratitude, for the guidance, for the challenge, and for the opportunity to grow. Clint Eastwood, watching from afar, simply nodded, recognizing a rare quality that went beyond talent. Someone who knew who they were not, and how to navigate the space in between with grace. The next day on set, the atmosphere was different. Jonathan Roumie arrived with the same quiet confidence, but there was an edge to the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to hang around him. Clint Eastwood had made his statement clear the day before. "You're not Jesus." For most actors, such words would have lingered, festered, and affected their performance. For Jonathan, however, it became a challenge, an invitation to confront not the role, but himself. As the crew prepared for the morning scene, Jonathan found himself alone near the props table. He picked up a simple wooden staff, the one he would use in the next shot, and ran his fingers along its worn surface. It was a humble object, yet it symbolized everything about the character he portrayed: guidance, patience, and resilience. He thought about Clint's words again. "You're not Jesus." At first, they stung. Even the most composed individuals feel the pull of doubt when confronted with blunt honesty from someone of Clint's stature. But then Jonathan shifted his perspective. He realized that the critique wasn't personal. It was a reflection of reality. A reminder that no matter how skilled he became, he could never truly embody the divine perfection of Jesus. What he could do, however, was embody truth, empathy, and authenticity. That realization was a turning point. Just then, a young actor on set, new to the role and nervous about the day's shooting, approached him. "Jonathan, how do you stay so calm under pressure? Clint's words yesterday, they shook me." Jonathan smiled gently, resting a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's not about what people say. It's about how you respond. If you carry yourself with respect, humility, and purpose, criticism can become a lesson rather than a burden." Clint Eastwood, watching from his director's chair, noticed the exchange. He had seen many actors crumble, argue, or sulk when confronted with blunt truth. But Jonathan's composure, patience, and clarity of mind stood out like a beacon. Clint leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp, analyzing every micro-expression. He had a way of observing not just performance, but character, and he could tell when someone's integrity was genuine. As filming began, the first take was difficult. Jonathan stumbled slightly on a line, not from lack of preparation, but from the emotional weight of the scene. The crew held their breath. Clint called cut, but he didn't scold. He simply walked over, looked Jonathan in the eye, and said, "Focus on why you're saying the words. Not the words themselves, the reason behind them." Jonathan nodded. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaled deeply, and stepped back into the scene. This time, something shifted. His gestures became deliberate, his tone carried intention, and his presence filled the room. The staff, crew, and fellow actors couldn't help but notice. This was not merely acting, it was authenticity, a rare and electrifying kind of presence. Halfway through the day, another challenge arose. A sudden technical issue with the lighting forced multiple takes to be reshot. The new actor from earlier grew frustrated, snapping at the crew. Jonathan kindly intervened, speaking softly but firmly. We all have a role to play. If we lose our patience, we lose the moment. The young actor, initially defensive, paused and then took a deep breath, following Jonathan's example. Clint Eastwood observed silently, a hint of admiration in his eyes. He had been a part of Hollywood long enough to recognize true leadership, and here it was, not declared, not forced, but naturally emanating from someone who understood humility and responsibility. Jonathan wasn't trying to impress anyone, he simply led by example. By the afternoon, the tension on set had dissipated. The energy shifted from uncertainty to focused collaboration. Jonathan's response to Clint's blunt words, the choice to remain humble, composed, and intentional, had not only affected his performance, but had also transformed the environment around him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but those who were paying attention could feel it. Respect had been earned through action, not assertion. And then came the pivotal scene, the one requiring Jonathan to convey deep empathy and resolve, to inspire both awe and compassion in his fellow actors. Cameras rolled. Every movement, every glance, every word was charged with authenticity. Jonathan's presence was magnetic. Clint watched intently, his earlier skepticism replaced by a growing recognition. The man before him was not Jesus, but in that moment, he embodied the essence of humanity that made the character believable, relatable, and profound. When the scene ended, the set erupted in quiet applause. Not for Jonathan's skill alone, but for the example he had set. He had faced a challenge that could have intimidated, embarrassed, or derailed him, and instead, he had chosen calm, humility, and integrity. Clint Eastwood, observing from his chair, allowed himself a small, approving nod. Jonathan realized then that the conflict he faced wasn't external. It wasn't Clint's words, or the pressures of the set, or the expectations of the audience. It was internal, the battle between ego and authenticity, doubt and courage, fear and purpose. And by choosing the right response, he had not only transformed his own performance, but also inspired everyone around him. By the end of the day, Jonathan knew something essential. Conflict isn't just a hurdle, it's a mirror. It reflects who you are, and more importantly, who you can choose to become. Clint's words had been the spark. Jonathan's response had been the fire. And everyone on that set, knowingly or not, had been touched by the lesson. The moment the camera stopped rolling, the set felt different. There was a hum in the air, not from equipment, not from chatter, but from the unspoken realization that something extraordinary had just occurred. Jonathan Roumie, calm as ever, stood quietly, letting the energy settle around him. Crew members who had been tense earlier now moved, with a newfound sense of respect and focus. Even the veteran actors, often difficult to impress, exchanged glances as if acknowledging something rare. Jonathan himself felt a strange combination of relief and clarity. Clint Eastwood's blunt words, "You're not Jesus," had set off a chain reaction far beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just about the performance anymore, it was about leadership, humility, and the ripple effect one person's attitude could have on an entire environment. People began to approach him quietly, almost hesitantly at first. The young actor he had guided earlier returned, bowing his head slightly. "Jonathan, I just wanted to say thank you. I've never seen someone handle criticism like that. You made me realize I can control how I respond to." Jonathan smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the young actor's shoulder. "It's not about avoiding mistakes or criticism. It's about facing them with honesty and integrity. That's what matters." From the sidelines, a few crew members exchanged quiet conversations, trying to put words to what they had just witnessed. Some had expected tension, awkwardness, or even resentment after Clint's comment. Instead, they saw composure, focus, and, surprisingly, inspiration. A couple of the more cynical crew members whispered to each other, "He's not Jesus, but the way he handles himself. That's rare." Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood sat back in his director's chair, arms folded, a faint smile foaming on his face. He had seen countless actors over the years crumble under pressure, lose their temper, or inflate with pride after praise. Jonathan had done none of these things. Instead, he had turned a moment that could have been uncomfortable into one of transformation. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Clint was quiet, but his approval carried weight. It wasn't verbalized, but it didn't need to be. As the day progressed, the ripple effect became undeniable. Jonathan's presence seemed to settle everyone. The lighting cue worked more efficiently, the actors stayed in character longer, and even the background performers moved with precision. There was an energy shift, a collective understanding that composure, humility, and authenticity could change the entire dynamic of the set. Jonathan had become, in a sense, the quiet center everyone gravitated toward. During a brief break, Jonathan found a quiet corner and reflected. He thought back to Clint's words again. At first, they had felt like a challenge, almost a rebuke. But now, he understood, they were a test, a mirror showing not what he lacked, but how he chose to respond. His calm demeanor, his respect for others, and his ability to learn and adapt were what truly mattered. He realized that moments like this didn't define talent, they defined character. By mid-afternoon, even the extras began noticing the shift. One of them, a young woman in her early 20s, approached Jonathan as a YLY. "I don't even know you, but the way you handled yourself today, it's inspiring. It makes me want to do better, not just for the role, but for how I carry myself everywhere." Jonathan nodded warmly. "Remember, it's never about perfection. It's about respect, integrity, and staying true to yourself, no matter what someone says." Word of Jonathan's response began to spread quietly through the crew. Some of the directors and assistant producers, who had been skeptical of his casting, started to see a new depth in his performance. They realized that it wasn't just his acting that captivated the audience, it was the authenticity he brought to every interaction, every gesture, every word. Jonathan's calm under pressure had transformed potential tension into collaboration, proving that leadership didn't always come with a title, it came with action. As the final scenes of the day were shot, Jonathan moved with a quiet confidence, a gaze that seemed effortless. Clint Eastwood watched closely, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally nodding. He had seen actors rise and fall, stars burn bright and fade quickly, but Jonathan's response to yesterday's blunt remark left a lasting impression. It was rare, almost legendary, to witness someone face criticism and transform it into influence without a single word of defensiveness. By the time the sun began to set outside the studio, the set was calm, yet charged with a subtle electricity. Crew members lingered longer, actors discussed scenes more thoughtfully, and Jonathan simply observed, letting the impact of his composure ripple quietly through the room. Clint Eastwood's words had been the spark, but Jonathan's response had lit a fire of respect, humility, and admiration that would remain long after the cameras were turned off. As the day closed, one thing was clear, the true power of influence wasn't in being untouchable, untouchably perfect, or infallible, it was in being human, honest, and steady when challenged. Jonathan Roumie had demonstrated that with quiet strength, humility could change more than just a performance, it could transform a room, a set, and everyone who witnessed it. By the end of the week, the energy on set had completely transformed. What had begun as a tense atmosphere, charged with uncertainty and self-doubt, had now become a space where respect, focus, and humility dominated. Jonathan Roumie's quiet strength and composure in the face of Clint Eastwood's blunt remark, "You're not Jesus," had rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The crew, once skeptical of the new lead actor, began to notice subtle but profound changes. Camera operators who had been impatient with delays now worked in perfect sync with the actors. Lighting technicians who usually muttered complaints under their breath smiled and collaborated. Even background extras, who often drifted into distraction, followed cues more attentively, inspired by Jonathan's unwavering presence. It was clear, leadership doesn't always need a title, it often speaks quietly through actions. Jonathan, unaware of how much of an impact he had made, focused on the work itself. He continued to approach each scene with the same care and mindfulness, never rushing, never exaggerating. His gestures were natural, his expressions deliberate, his tone measured. And yet, something extraordinary happened. The authenticity he brought to the role began to shine in ways that transcended performance. It wasn't acting anymore, it was embodiment, a living reflection of the virtues he had internalized over the years. One afternoon, Clint Eastwood called Jonathan over to the side of the set. The veteran director's expression was unreadable at first, as always, but there was a glimmer of acknowledgement in his eyes. He handed Jonathan a small stack of notes and said, quietly but firmly, "I want you to read this. Then I want you to tell me what you think about it." Jonathan took the papers, flipping through them. They were annotations, kitty kiss, and suggestions for the next major sins. But there was something different in Clint's approach this time. There was no judgment, no tone of superiority, only guidance, tempered with respect. Jonathan realized that the man who had once questioned him was now offering mentorship. It was a subtle yet unmistakable acknowledgement. He had earned it, not by proving perfection, but by showing authenticity and humility. Moments later, word spread that Clint Eastwood had requested a private conversation with Jonathan. The crew quietly gave them space, sensing that history was being made in real time. Clint leaned back in his chair, studying Jonathan intently. "You know," he began, his voice calm but weighty, "most actors react in one of three ways. They crumble, they argue, or they pretend they know more than they do. You did something different. You listened. You reflected. You responded with integrity." Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He had not sought validation or approval. He had only aimed to act with purpose, to honor the role, and to embody the qualities he believed were essential. And now, the acknowledgement from one of cinema's greatest legends felt like the culmination of not just skill, but character. Then came the final revelation, one that would leave everyone present stunned. Clint Eastwood's voice softened, carrying a mix of admiration and rare humor. "You're not Jesus, but you've taught me something about what it looks like to lead with humility. You've seen a lot in my life, Jonathan, but this is extraordinary." The words hung in the air like a declaration, a public acknowledgement of Jonathan's quiet triumph. The crew and actors, sensing the gravity of the moment, began to gather around. Murmurs of astonishment spread like wildfire. "Did he just say that?" one assistant whispered. "Clint Eastwood said that." The young actors who had been intimidated earlier now looked at Jonathan with a mixture of awe and respect. Even the extras, who had simply been passing through, felt the weight of the lesson, that humility, composure, and authenticity could command more attention than any display of ego or bravado. Jonathan, ever composed, accepted the recognition without arrogance. He smiled, a small, genuine gesture, acknowledging both the honor and the responsibility. He knew that this moment wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about the example he set, and the impact it had on everyone who had witnessed it. By the end of the conversation, Clint Eastwood had offered more than praise. He had offered partnership. He invited Jonathan to collaborate closely on the upcoming scenes, not as a subordinate, but as a trusted colleague. The revelation was clear: respect is earned through character, not through titles, appearances, or even talent alone. Jonathan had demonstrated that the quiet, steadfast strength of humility could surpass any expectation. As word of the encounter spread throughout the studio, it became a story in itself. Crew members recounted it to friends, actors shared it with peers, and soon, even outside the set, the tale of how Jonathan Roumie responded to Clint Eastwood's blunt challenge began to circulate. People were inspired, not just by Jonathan's talent, but by the lesson he embodied. That true influence comes from integrity, not ego. And in that moment, Jonathan realized something profound. The conflict had never truly been about whether he could play Jesus. It had been about whether he could face challenge, criticism, and doubt, and respond in a way that elevated himself and everyone around him. And he had. By the time the week drew to a close, the atmosphere on set had transformed completely. What had begun as tension, self-doubt, and cautious observation had become something far more profound. A sense of respect, collaboration, and shared purpose. Jonathan Roumie, once quietly navigating the challenges of criticism and expectation, had now become a quiet force, shaping not only the energy of the set but also the hearts and minds of those around him. It was a crisp afternoon when Clint Eastwood called Jonathan over one last time. The director's face, usually unreadable, now carried a subtle warmth, a rare gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone standing nearby. The crew instinctively gave them space, aware that this was a pivotal moment, the culmination of days of tension, reflection, and personal growth. Clint's voice was steady, calm, but carried the weight of experience. "Jonathan," he said, "I've seen a lot in my life. You've worked with legends, stars, and newcomers alike. Many crumble when faced with criticism. Many fight it. Few truly listen, reflect, and grow from it. You've done all that. You've handled yourself with a rare integrity." Jonathan met Clint's gaze, a mixture of humility and quiet pride in his expression. "I'm grateful for the guidance, sir," he replied softly. "I've learned that criticism is only as powerful as the way we respond to it. It's never about proving anything. It's about understanding and growing." Clint's eyes, sharp and perceptive as ever, studied Jonathan for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a genuine, approving smile. "You're not Jesus," he said, echoing the words that had started it all. "But the way you carry yourself. That's a kind of grace I've rarely seen. You've taught me something about humility and leadership, Jonathan. You've taught all of us." The crew and actors, who had been watching quietly from a distance, began to murmur among themselves. Some smiled knowingly, recognizing the significance of the exchange. Others simply stood in awe, realizing that they had just witnessed a rare lesson in character, resilience, and quiet influence. This wasn't about fame, accolades, or performance. It was about the human ability to respond to challenge with authenticity and strength. Jonathan, ever composed, nodded and allowed himself a small moment of reflection. He understood that this acknowledgement from Clint Eastwood was not just a compliment, it was validation of the path he had chosen. The choice to remain humble, to listen, and to respond with integrity had not only shaped his performance, but had transformed the set itself. The lesson was clear: true influence comes not from power, position, or outward authority, but from the quiet strength of character. Later, as the crew began to wrap up the day, Jonathan moved through the set with a calm awareness of the impact he had made. He paused occasionally to offer encouragement, to acknowledge effort, or to simply share a moment of understanding with someone who had struggled earlier. Every gesture was subtle, yet it carried a weight that resonated deeply with those who witnessed its leadership. He realized, wasn't about commanding attention. It was about creating an environment where others felt empowered, respected, and inspired. Clint, meanwhile, observed from a distance, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally nodding. He had been in the business long enough to recognize genuine talent, but he also knew that talent alone was fleeting. What made Jonathan remarkable wasn't just his ability to act, it was his ability to elevate everyone around him through calm, humility, and integrity. Clint's approval was silent, yet it spoke volumes. By the end of the day, the finest scene had been shot. Jonathan's performance was lauded by the entire crew, not merely for its technical excellence, but for the authenticity he brought to the role. Every movement, every glance, every word reflected a depth that had grown not just from preparation but from character. The lesson of the week was clear: how one responds to challenge defines more than just performance, it defines influence, respect, and legacy. As the studio lights dimmed and people began to leave, Jonathan stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the calm that now filled the space. He thought back to Clint's words from the first day. "You're not Jesus." At the time, they had been startling, almost disorienting. But now, after days of reflection, challenge, and growth, he understood the truth behind them. The words weren't meant to diminish him. They were meant to reveal the power of humility, the strength of integrity, and the influence of quiet confidence. Clint Eastwood approached him one last time, this time offering a firm handshake. "Remember this," Clint said, his voice carrying both authority and warmth. "It's never about being perfect. It's about how you handle yourself when you're tested. Today, you passed with flying colors." Jonathan smiled, a genuine, serene smile. "Thank you, sir. I'll carry this lesson with me always." And with that, the story of the week came full circle. The conflict, the tension, the silent battles, they had all led to a revelation that extended far beyond the set. Jonathan had faced criticism, challenge, and doubt, and had emerged not just as a better actor, but as a better human being. Clint Eastwood's words, blunt and unflinching, had sparked a transformation that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. In that moment, it became clear to all who had witnessed it: true respect, true influence, and true strength are earned not through position or title, but through character, humility, and the courage to remain authentic even when challenged. Jonathan Roumie left the set that evening not just as an actor, but as a living example of the quiet power of integrity, and a lesson that would ripple far beyond the cameras, scripts, and lights. As the studio emptied and the sun dipped low over the Hollywood skyline, Jonathan Roumie lingered for a moment, reflecting on the week that had unfolded. What had begun with a simple, blunt remark, Clint Eastwood's words, "You're not Jesus," had grown into something far greater than any script or scene. It had become a lesson, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it, a lesson in humility, authenticity, and the quiet power of character. Jonathan understood now that true strength doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't come in loud proclamations, in dramatic gestures, or in attempts to dominate a room. Real strength manifests quietly, in moments when no one is looking, or when everyone is, and you still choose the path of integrity. Clint's words had been a spark, but Jonathan's response had been the flame that lit the hearts of everyone around him. Over the week, He had seen firsthand how one person's composure could ripple outward. A nervous actor who had been ready to snap under pressure now stood taller, more confident. Crew members who had been distracted or impatient found themselves working more thoughtfully, with focus and collaboration. Even Clint Eastwood, a man renowned for his unflinching bluntness and perfectionism, had quietly acknowledged Jonathan's presence, noting the subtle leadership he had displayed. It was a reminder that influence isn't always loud, it's earned, observed, and respected. Jonathan thought back to the moment he first heard the words, the sting of doubt that initially struck him. Most would have bristled, argued, or been shaken to their core. Many actors, even talented ones, might have allowed criticism to destabilize them. But Jonathan had chosen a different path. He had listened. He had reflected. He had responded, not with ego, not with defensiveness, but with humility, focus, and intentionality. In doing so, he had not only grown as an actor, but he had elevated everyone around him. This realization carried a profound life lesson. Respect, humility, and integrity are not qualities reserved for those in positions of authority or fame. They are human qualities, accessible to anyone willing to act with sincerity. Jonathan had learned that true power doesn't come from titles, accolades, or recognition. It comes from the way you treat people, the way you respond to challenge, and the way you maintain composure when confronted with doubt. As he stepped out of the studio, the cool evening air brushing against his face, Jonathan reflected on the subtle lessons that often go unnoticed. Life, much like a film set, is full of moments where we are tested, not for show, not for applause, but to reveal our character. In those moments, we have a choice, to react with ego, fear, or defensiveness, or to respond with grace, humility, and integrity. The choice defines not only the outcome, but who we become in the process. Even as the camera stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, Jonathan's influence lingered. Crew members carried the lesson forward in their work and interactions. Actors absorbed the calm authority he had displayed. And even Clint Eastwood recognized that sometimes, the quietest actors teach the loudest lessons. The impact of humility and authenticity was undeniable, resonating far beyond the scripted lines and rehearsed scenes. Jonathan understood that this story was bigger than acting. It was about human behavior, about how we treat one another, and about the values we choose to embody even when challenged. It was about realizing that respect isn't given, it's shown. True respect is earned through consistent actions, through character, and through the courage to remain authentic in moments that matter most. As the city lights of Los Angeles began to twinkle, Jonathan felt a sense of calm fulfillment. He had faced criticism, uncertainty, and challenge, and he had emerged not only unshaken, but strengthened. The experience had reaffirmed his belief that humility is not weakness, composure is not passivity, and authenticity is more powerful than any accolade. For those who had witnessed it, the lesson was simple but profound. Treat others with respect, remain grounded under challenge, and let integrity guide your actions. Because one day, the person who questions you, dubs you, or challenges you may very well become the one whose approval, recognition, or influence matters most. And when that day comes, the quiet strength of humility will shine brighter than any display of ego ever could. Jonathan's final thought as he walked away from the set was this: true power is silent. True respect is earned. True influence is lived, not declared. He turned to the empty street, took a deep breath, and smiled. The lesson wasn't just for him, it was for anyone willing to listen, observe, and act with integrity. And in that realization, Jonathan Roumie found not only peace but purpose. Type humility in the comments if you believe staying grounded is true strength. And share where you're watching from, because every person who values respect and integrity matters.